The Last of Us series is not unlike the parasitic fungus from the game, inhabiting something that was once human, but twisting and transforming it into something else. Something boring. The controversy that the second game kicked up has sadly taken over the brain and become the model of how this series gets attention now by being controversial for controversy's sake. It honestly pains me to watch something I loved not just die, but mutate into a horrifying shell of its former self. And about that second game, we need to settle the score there once and for all as far as whether or not it was successful. Now, I have a whole video explaining why it's not. You can go watch it. But we do have definitive proof now that the second game was not very successful, and there's really one easy way to explain why. You see, it only sold 10 million copies total over the course of 3 years. Many of those copies were sold at a steep discount, $20 or less. Now, the recently released God of War Ragnarok sold 11 million copies in just 3 months. Wow. The typical defenses of Last of Us 2 being the fastest selling game and selling 4 million copies at launch have just both been vaporized. What remains are access journalists clapping along like trained seals to the show's every new release, and none of them would ever dare discuss what I'm about to put forward. The critical response to the show tells you everything you need to know about how modern cultural consensus is crafted. Now, it's basic human psychology to not want to be in an out group, so if you're susceptible to societal pressure, you will join the collective once a sufficient number of signals have been received by your brain. Not to mention the advertising deals and access to software and hardware many of the larger sites will want to maintain. The smaller ones are just simping for clicks, churning out an endless stream of digital drivel for what little ad revenue it can generate. This is why you will never, ever see a critical piece of games journalism about Naughty Dog, The Last of Us, or Neil Druckmann. It simply will not happen. Not even mild criticism. This fact alone reveals that the game is rigged. But rigged to what end? Manufacturing Consent is a fascinating book about how the media is used to manipulate the public and achieve specific political or financial ends. Now, you don't need to be a genius to notice this happening all around us, as the process has seemingly shifted into warp speed, and the battle over reality is joined across our culture. Just wait until AI is impersonating you at work. If you aren't skeptical of what major news corporations tell you, now would be a fantastic time to start. The same sort of game is being played out in the entertainment world. The creators have certain ideas they'd like you to believe, and they'll weave them into the show in the hopes that that will be the thing that tips the scale in your brain towards joining their consensus. Now, I'll say here that I am not talking about which consensus is right or wrong. I'm merely pointing to the process to try and influence you. So again, I'm not saying anything about right or wrong here, merely that this process is being rolled out with the aim of manipulating you. Now, this was done rather inarticulately by Neil Druckmann in The Last of Us Part 2 with its on-the-nose, far-left political platitudes and barely coherent story, but there are echoes of it in the show, and they're slowly but surely getting worse. Most notably is the show's third episode, which focuses entirely on a gay romance. This is a complete departure from the game. This would be fine if handled with the least bit of art, but what plays out on the screen is not only riddled with plot holes and errors, it's a bizarrely contradictory statement about both normalizing non-heterosexual relationships and promoting marginalized groups. The core argument of the episode is that there's no discernible difference between gay and straight relationships, but as it's making this argument, it's also saying that having an entire episode celebrate and showcase a gay romance is, and of itself, a landmark achievement in television. So, which is it? Are gay relationships purely analogous to straight ones, or are they somehow better? This is what I'll call the Bill and Frank argument. Now, I'll say here that I don't have any qualms with whatever kind of relationships consenting adults want to pursue. My criticism here has nothing to do with sexuality. After all, how do you know I'm not gay? What I find so out of place here is that the show takes a major detour to tell a story that goes nowhere, presents nothing of interest, and detracts from the main storyline in a significant way. I will briefly recap the episode for those who haven't seen it. Bill, presented as a far-right conspiracy theorist, stays behind when his town is evacuated during the outbreak. This is a good idea because the military just decide to take everyone outside town and just shoot them so that Joel and Ellie could come along later and have a mass grave to look at and be all sad about. So despite plot hole number 1, 99.99% compliance in a crisis, Bill finds himself the new de facto mayor of his town. Thus begins the only fun part of the episode, with everyone's fantasy of getting to run around in a world that suddenly has no rules. But stories still have rules, and they're breaking pretty much all of them in this episode. Now, it's already been established that Outbreak Day was pure chaos. We saw Joel's day, and it was insanity, with planes falling out of the sky, infected running amok, and people turning on each other in the ensuing panic. And somehow, not only was no one in Bill's town infected by the contaminated food or stay behind like him, he's able to go to Home Depot, a gas station, and the local natural gas plant completely unhindered by man or zombie alike. Even the roads are all 100% clear on Outbreak Day, whereas later we see that other roads are completely clogged with abandoned cars. There's even just one zombie for the entire episode, and it's dispatched with a trap that somehow perfectly matches its exact height. Then we're asked to believe that for a period of 20 years, Bill and his companion Frank never see a single infected person. There's no piles of corpses around the perimeter of their town. They last well into old age, completely unmolested by the infected. I would just like to point out here that the creators took special pains to rewrite how the cordyceps work to make it so that it incessantly seeks out its victims.
Well, now, there is reason to evolve. One gene mutates, and an Ascomycetia, Candida, ergot, Cordyceps, Aspergillus, any one of them could become capable of burrowing into our brains and taking control not of millions of us, but billions of us. Billions of puppets with poisoned minds, permanently fixed on one unifying goal: to spread the infection to every last human alive by any means necessary.
It will not stop until every human being on Earth is infected. And yet the entire population of Massachusetts, infected or not, completely avoid this small town for over 2 decades? Fucking what? Now, there is such a thing as peaks and valleys in a show where danger is a major theme, but you can't simply shut the danger off for an hour and a half straight. There's one comically stupid gun battle with Bill shooting it out with bandits in the middle of the street. This is yet another plot hole because someone with a doomsday bunker and enough firearms to start the apocalypse themselves would be firing from cover from an elevated position, not exposed, standing upright in the middle of the street, making themselves a big fat target. I won't even get into how stupid these bandits are to attack at night against an unknown force and by walking up to a fence that anyone with 2 brain cells would know is likely booby-trapped. They also somehow managed to miss all of the traps, the hole traps that Frank eventually gets caught in. Bill also gets shot in the stomach and then magically heals somehow. I mean, this is a perfect example of what they could have changed even just with a single line of dialogue to make sense. Frank could have said, "Hey, I'm a doctor," when they first met. Easy, right? But the writers they're too lazy to do that. I could go on and on with the plot holes and sloppy writing, but I think you get it. The thought that should have gone into making the episode consistent with the world established in the first 2 episodes is sacrificed for the Bill and Frank argument. The Bill and Frank argument is confusing because it has this posture as if there is still crucial advocating that must be done on behalf of sexual minorities. Yes, the same ones that appear almost everywhere in music, TV, movies, and media, and have earned over the last 30 years significant protections under the law. I'm half expecting them to announce Indiana Jones is gay in his upcoming movie. I would argue that at large, the progress towards greater acceptance of sexual minorities has been largely achieved, and that's something we should be really proud of. So what exactly is happening here that's so avant-garde? Now, you could argue that progress needed to be well cemented before the Bill and Frank episode could be made, but I'd turn right around and direct you to the countless other pieces of gay media that preceded this one, but whatever. Defense of this episode came prepackaged with accusations of homophobia, being about as predictable as rain in October. This echoes what happened with The Last of Us 2, where a gay romance, which like Bill and Frank's is utterly undeveloped, is included just simply for the sake of it. Neil Druckmann, I believe, wanted to strike back against the perceived homophobia and bro culture of gamers, and that's a very misguided and simplified and honestly reductive view of people who enjoy video games. But this spawned the bigot sandwiches moment from the game, which some of you who've had the misfortune of playing that awful experience will remember.
Look, last night I was drinking too much.
Sure.
I'm trying to say I'm sorry. Maria tells me that you and Dean are headed out. I made you some sandwiches.
Okay.
Your steak.
Thank you, Seth.
Yeah, well, you be safe out there.
Yep.
I appreciate that.
What you got there?
Bigot sandwiches.
Smells good.
He would likewise slander criticism of the game as bigotry. But where is all this consensus building going? Where will it end? I don't know. I guess when every month is Pride and we're all pansexuals. But for all this blue team cheerleading going on, I simply have one thing to say. It's boring. It's boring when you inject your obvious politics into things, whatever your persuasion is, if you be right or left. It's boring to revive the ghost of past revolutions because you, as the creator, feel their effect is waning. It's boring when you decide to sacrifice art to woke platitudes. It's boring when you present things at face value and expect the audience to cheer just because you believe there's some kind of overlap with current-day sexual politics. The ultimate proof of this is just to imagine the episode, but the characters are all straight. It would be boring because the creators are more concerned with the public reaction this episode will create rather than writing interesting characters or situations. Like Ellie and Dina's relationship, Bill and Frank is entirely on the surface. They grow old together, but we never see them go through the kinds of things that would make their relationship believable. Why do they like each other? Don't know. What else have they gone through that deepens their relationship? Not a clue. They even fall in love and have sex on the afternoon that they meet. I mean, Jesus, at least figure out if Bill is a fucking cannibal first, Frank. If I were writing the show, it would have gone a little something like this. Bill is the town conspiracy theorist, and he tries to warn everybody about the fungus. Frank, the town's mayor, embarrasses him at a community meeting assembled in the early days of the outbreak. Post-outbreak, the town collapses into chaos, and Bill emerges from his bunker to survey the ruins. He's grief-stricken over his destroyed town, which he loved despite being an outsider, and blames himself for being too awkward to communicate effectively with his neighbors and warn them. He tears into himself out loud, berating himself for his failures, when out of a dumpster pops Frank. Frank tells him he should have listened to him, but Bill is too upset and storms off. The two avoid each other, but each start cleaning up debris and fixing up their respective ends of town. They finally meet again in the town square, where each have been building a memorial to the fallen townspeople. It's then that they open up to each other, each man admitting to the other where he feels he's gone wrong and how badly each wish that they could change the past. Bill wishes he could be less awkward, and Frank wishes he could have looked past his own biases of Bill's appearance and his politics and actually listened to what he had to say. Bill then invites Frank over and gradually shows him a side of himself that he's kept private for so long, that he's actually a closeted gay man, but due to a harsh upbringing never felt he could show it. And so begins the romance between the two men. The difference between the show's version of events and mine is that the characters are more grounded, they have a history, and each has flaws that need to be overcome. The personal transformation each man goes through culminates in a bond that forms between them through grief and survival. The show, on the other hand, does none of this. We get no detailed history of the characters, they instantly fall in love, and we're supposed to be fawning over this because they grow old together and decide to commit suicide. It's basically Romeo and Juliet if you took the first and last acts and mushed them together. They could have done a lot more with the runtime of this episode, and I'm sorry they took a route that feels cheap. The game did the same thing and suffered for it. Does anyone honestly go back and think about part 2, the romance between Ellie and Dina? That was really well constructed and had a big payoff in the story. No, of course not, because that was shallow and pointless too. What's really a shame is what was sacrificed from the game. The Bill section of the game is one of my favorites to play because it's a great example of how a game handles its supporting cast. Bill is a warning to Joel about hopelessness. Bill is just surviving for survival's sake, believing that shutting himself off from the world is the best way to stay alive. They try to touch on this in the show, but instantly defeat the point because when push comes to shove, Bill does allow Frank to form relationships with outsiders. Bill is what you become when losing someone you care about breaks you. You get mean. You blame the world. You become cruel. This was such an important part of the game for Joel because not only does he bond with Ellie as they survive the infected and Bill's traps, but he sees what he's in very real danger of becoming. In this version, they get none of that development. It's all sacrificed. They just simply show up, they get the car, the guns, everything, all for free. But there's no such thing as free lunch, especially when it comes to writing. I have to say, outside of Nick Offerman's performance, this episode and this show is recreating patterns from the second and much less popular game. It's almost like Druckmann is in the shadows, whispering in Craig Mazin's ear, trying to get him to try out ideas that he's desperate to prove work somewhere besides his own head. But of course they don't. Expect the rest of the show to follow suit. If you genuinely enjoyed the show, good, great, I'm happy for you. But you seem to be easily impressed.
Your booze mean nothing. I've seen what makes you cheer.
Ask yourself what exactly makes it a great episode of TV. What about the characters, the plot, the story you found so compelling or novel? My guess is your answer will be emotionally charged, but without any depth. If you have the courage to examine yourself, I welcome you to reality. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a like if you enjoyed it, leave a comment, or hey, subscribe. It really helps the video reach more people, and it will encourage me to make more. Until next time, game on.